Oh, it's live. Hello. I'm reading Prelude to the Landing on Planet Earth. I've read this book before, but it's quite a while ago, and I fancy reading it again, and I'm reading it aloud. We are on chapter 2, The Forming of the Triangle. This is about a trip, a journey with 3 people through the Middle East. It was published in 1977. And STUART HOLROYD accounts here the beginning, how it all started, and they were looking at Bobby, who is a healer, to be included in the communications. I continue here where I stopped, because they didn't want to tell Bobby what the ultimate purpose was, which was channeling extraterrestrials. We need something to tell him, Phyllis protested, but she received only the assurance that he would know and accept everything soon. They were obviously going to get no further on that track, so Andrija took from his pocket a list of questions he had prepared. First, was Korean aware of his own connection with Hoover? Hoover was the name of the extraterrestrial civilization that he and Geller had been given to understand they were in contact with. Korean answered, "There are many who work with many on your planet. You have been contacted. You have done much already. We will advise you soon of what we ask you to do." Was Korean aware of who Yuri Geller was? Andrija asked. Were they connected with the space people who used Geller as a channel? "We know of this," was the answer. "We do not work with him now." And to Andreja's further question whether they communicated with a group that worked with him, Korean replied, "Yes, we are many groups, and we are one." Returning to the subject of Bobby, Andrija asked if Korean had been responsible for the supposed poltergeist effects around him some months before. "Yes, just like the burn brought you here, these things brought Phyllis here." "Pretty tricky you are," Andrija said with a laugh. "You have been very clever in bringing Bobby, Phyllis and me together. Are there any other people we should move out towards or be aware of that you could identify or name?" "The arrangements will be made for you to meet another," Korean answered. "You will be meeting number 3 soon." Andrija had a number of questions about the types of healing that Bobby would be capable of and the strategy they should pursue in publicizing his abilities. He mentioned the International Conference on Healing, the May lectures to be held in London in 2 months' time, and asked if it would be a good idea for Bobby to attend and demonstrate his healing powers. "These are the ones who will aid you, yes," Koren said, referring to the doctor and other interested parties who would be attending the conference. But the most important thing was not to rush Bobby, not to demand too much of him too soon, to be content initially with the convincing only a small nucleus of people of his abilities. Ultimately, if with care he could be made physically and mentally strong enough, he would be able to help heal any condition. There's nothing that cannot be helped. There's nothing that cannot be corrected. But we will not again now do a work like the burn, which was to draw you. We will start easy. We will start with lesser work to see how this can be accepted. If this is accepted, then things like you speak of will be accepted and done. It was going to be Phyllis's task to guide, control and pace Bobby's healing work, and to help his wife to understand him and to give him her support. "You must try to explain to her that this work will not take away from her, but will add," Korean said. Phyllis promised to try, and after an exchange of cordialities and thanks, "Wonderful talking to you," said Phyllis, and a great privilege, said Andrija. Bobby was brought out of trance and the session ended. In view of the proposal that Bobby should go to London for the conference on health and healing in May, Andrija wanted to arrange for the organizer and major sponsor of the conference, Sir John Whitmore, to meet him. John was going to be in New York at the beginning of April, together with his friend, the English author and biologist Lyle Watson, who was also going to participate in the conference. So Andrija arranged for Phyllis and Bobby to be his guests at the same time. When John and some friends in England conceived the idea of giving London a taste of some of the positive developments on the counterculture scene, Andrija was the first person he thought of as a potential contributor. He had heard him lecture in California a couple of years before and had been impressed both by Andrija himself and by his talk, which had been about his work with Arrigo. He had approached Andrija and had found him not only willing to be a contributor, but enthusiastic about the whole project and immensely helpful with suggestions and introductions to other potential participants. So when Andrija told him about Bobby Horn and the strange communication that had come through him, and the proposal that he should participate in the conference, John was keen to hear more. The best way to put him in the picture, Andrija suggested, when John arrived at Ossining with Lyle on the 7th of April, would be for John to listen to the tapes of the 2 communications with Korean that they had had in Orlando 3 weeks before. When he had heard the tapes, John's mind raced with questions, doubts and suspicion. Who was fooling who, he wondered? Or was it a case of collective delusion? Or a practical joke played by discerning beings, spirits of the dead who were mischievously sporting with the living to pass their time while they were waiting to reincarnate? This was perhaps a wild idea, but there had to be some explanation, and at least the evidence of spirits was better substantiated than that of space beings. Bobby had to be the #1 suspect, since he did most of the talking or channeling, or as they called it, or channeling as they called it. Suppose that he was only pretending to be in trance state, or even, or even that he really was in such a state and it was his unconscious that was engaging in the dialogue. The story of the burn healing was suspicious, particularly as the main evidence for it was the photographs that Bobby himself had so conveniently taken before and after the event. But for Bobby to have invented and to masquerade as Korean and to fool 2 people as experienced in psychic studies as Andrija and Phyllis would have required knowledge, cunning and ingenuity surely quite beyond Bobby's capabilities. When they had met the previous day, Bobby had made John nervous, probably because he was so obviously nervous and out of place himself. He was tall, lithe and dark-skinned. He moved awkwardly and spoke hesitantly and softly with a southern drawl. Much of the conversation that had taken place in the house those 2 days seemed to go above his head. And though he was clearly excited as being involved with these people and a focus of their interest, he was worried about having left his wife and child behind in Daytona Beach. He just could be pulling a hoax, John thought, but he couldn't understand how. If that were so, Bobby could have spontaneously produced a scenario that so neatly tallied with Andreja's previous communications with extraterrestrials, announcing a forthcoming landing and soliciting help in preparing mankind for it. He couldn't have read Andreja's book on Uri, for that was still in the press and not to be published until May. But if Bobby could be eliminated as either a deliberate or unwitting hoaxer, what about Andrija? The way the Korean communication dovetailed with the communications, he and Geller had experienced, and the fact that Bobby had come into Andrija's life so soon after the split with Yuri, just as Yuri had come in soon after the death of Arrigo, were factors in the situation that had to be accounted for and naturally aroused suspicion. Did Andrija possess such great telepathic powers that he could project through a sequence of mediums? For before Yuri there had been Dr. Vinod, a complex and consistent scenario that served only to flatter his own ego? The facts certainly supported such a hypothesis. The trouble was that the facts were equally compatible with the hypothesis that the communications were from extraterrestrials who had chosen Andrija to be their ambassador. On that supposition, it would be logical that Andrija should have been led to one medium after another, and that after the misfiring of the Geller project, the space people should adopt a representative endowed with paranormal powers more useful to mankind than an ability to bend metal. Phyllis, who seemed a sensible and capable woman, had testified that Bobby had already effected some quite remarkable healings, and that was a fact that didn't fit in with Andrija as telepath theory. The alleged communications and the healings were separate phenomena and not necessarily connected, and for that matter there was no necessary connection between the communications received and the powers exhibited by Geller. But if there wasn't a necessary connection, there certainly was a meaningful one, what Jung would have called a synchronistic one. To maintain that the communications were a product of Andrija's unconscious, and that Yuri's psychokinesis and Bobby's healings were phenomena unconnected with each other and with the communications, would surely be to practice a kind of philosophical caution and hair-splitting more likely to obscure the truth of the matter than to elucidate it. Such were the perplexities that John grappled with after hearing the tapes of the first two communications. They were mind-boggling, and he thought quite insoluble in the present state of his knowledge. He would have to learn, see and hear much more before he could hope to make sense of the whole situation. There had been 3 more communications in the previous fortnight, and he now proceeded to listen to the recordings of these. The experience did nothing to alleviate his bewilderment, but on the contrary increased and complicated it, for these communications brought Phyllis into prominence and under suspicion. He had liked Phyllis immensely when they had first met the previous day, though with her blonde hairdo, heavy makeup, smart clothes and feminine small talk, she didn't fit his preconception of a spiritually developed person. She was warm and communicative, and in this situation reassuringly normal. But the recordings he now listened to utterly confounded these first impressions of Phyllis. Andrija had left Orlando after the second session with Bobby, but before going he had given Bobby post-hypnotic suggestions to enable Phyllis to put him into trance, just as he had done. This she did the following day, 19th of March. The ensuing communication was largely about some events that had occurred in Phyllis's class and about how she could help Bobby's work as a healer and gain his wife's support. But in the middle of the session, there was a description by Phyllis of an operation being performed on Bobby, and though Phyllis's voice was level and matter-of-fact, what she said was too fantastic, too hallucinatory raving, too like a hallucinatory raving to be believed. John hadn't paid much attention to the talk in the previous communications about preparing Bobby's physical body for his healing work by equipping it with a kind of electronic circuitry, but now Corinne announced that further adjustments were to be made in Bobby, and the present was a good time to make them, and that if Phyllis wished to watch, she could do so. Phyllis said she would, and that she would describe what she saw happening, so that Dr. Puharich could listen to the description later. "Yes, this is what we desire," said Korean. Phyllis's description followed. As I am watching and observing Bobby, his head has been turned towards his right shoulder about a 30 to 35 degree angle, and from his left temple to his neck area, to his collarbone, there is a glow, and behind his left ear there appears to be a filling out in the neck area. His color is changing, his aura is changing. It seems to be given an electrical surge of energy. There appears to be wires going into his hands, very fine gold wires, and they metallic bands of some sort, about a 1/4 inch, right. It's beginning to circle his head. There appears to be a swelling in the left side of his neck muscle, a little to the rear and below the ear, and there appears to be a rod of some sort that's also glowing. And then there is a glowing light like a pencil, a pen light, which seems to be coming halfway up his left ear, about 2 inches to the rear of his hair. His watch is starting to magnetize, to glow on its own. I think perhaps in the future we should remove the watch. When I am in this aura, in his vibration, and can pick up the physical condition, I can feel it in my own back, a group of wires. It seems to be. Although I cannot observe this, I can feel it. Things seem to be going through the spinal cord, starting at the base of the spine. Bobby's head is now starting to turn around. Now there's a band glowing underneath his shirt, around his chest area. Now all that seems to be done, and he seems to be relaxed and in a deep sleep, and around his throat is a very bright reddish type of vibration or aura. The adjustments seem to have been made. This talk of rods, wires, and glowing metallic bands was just too bizarre. Had Phyllis really seen these things? Would he have seen them if he had been present? Would Andrija? Wasn't this whole idea of mysterious processes of bioengineering a bit too reminiscent of a science fiction TV movie? Yes, but after the session, when Bobby was out of trance, he and Phyllis had examined his body at the points where he had seen some of the adjustments being made, and their conversation had also been recorded. They spoke of visible puncture marks and links, and lines like thin scars on Bobby's hands, chest and head. And later the same day, Bobby had done a healing on Phyllis's husband, Norman, and during and after the attempt, apparently, the red puncture marks on his hands had become much darker and more prominent. If that were true, it certainly seemed to indicate that something had happened to Bobby during the earlier session, and that Phyllis's observations couldn't be written off as hallucinations. Soon after this, Andrija had returned to Florida, and a curious event, which was eventually to prove more significant than they realized at the time, had taken place at the Miami home of a friend of Andrija's, Count Pino Turola. The Count was something of an eccentric, an independent scholar and explorer, and he had recently returned from Ecuador and brought with him a number of artifacts, one of which a small figure. Phyllis was given to hold in order to see what psychic impressions she received from it. A thing unprecedented in Phyllis's experience had happened while she was holding this object. She had fallen into an involuntary trance and began to chant in a high-pitched voice, in some strange language. The Count, delighted, seized a native whistle and tried to play an accompaniment. Andrija politely thanked the entity communicating through Phyllis for the beautiful chant and tried to get it to identify itself. The voice said "Ake-a," and then followed a flood of rapid, speech-like sounds. Andrija assumed that Ake-a was the name of the god figurine that Phyllis was holding, and that the language was that of an ancient civilization. More chanting followed. "Thank you for that beautiful blessing," Andrija said, with John thought incredible composure, as if being entertained by an ancient god was an everyday occurrence. Then he asked permission to call on one of Phyllis's regular guides to explain in English what had just happened, and after a pause a totally different voice emanated from Phyllis and said, "Hello, this is Tom." Andrija recalled that Phyllis had told him that she had on several occasions in the past channeled an entity named Tom, whom she had assumed was the spirit of her grandfather, Thomas. At Andrija's request, Tom obligingly explained that the language they had just heard came from some 34,000 years ago, and that at that time they were 3 cultures, 3 divisions from 3 areas of the universe. One came with love, one came to own, and one came to observe. "Please continue, this is very enlightening," Andrija said. The entity that had spoken through Phyllis, Tom, further explained was a being that gathered all 3 together to discuss an amnesty. The one that observed recorded it, the one that possessed controlled the minds, the being that came tried to prevent. There was a massacre. A much more advanced civilization began, then was lost. Asked by Andrija to identify in modern geographical terms the place on Earth where this first intervention by the space people had taken place, Tom gave the figures 40 and 79, which Andrija then ascertained were the latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates. Then Tom said he had to leave, but would return another day. And when Andrija brought Phyllis out of trance, she said she wanted to cry and felt that she hadn't finished, which, though nobody realized it then, was probably the understatement of her life. John had been in some bizarre situation before, but by the end of the first day at Ossining, he was beginning to think that this was rapidly building up into his most way-out experience ever. It wasn't only the tapes. The people and their conversation, the house and its surroundings, all contributed to a general eerie effect. The house seemed so isolated and old-fashioned, and the great mature trees in the grounds and the heavily wooden hillside rising sharply to the rear, with a mysterious derelict stone tower standing in the middle of it, constituted a setting pregnant with suggestions of the supernatural and in keeping with the activities of a mad scientist. The domestic arrangements were looked after by 2 young women. One was quiet, observant, and moved with a captivating filial grace. The other was excitable, and she kept professing to see and experience things that, so far as John could make out, nobody else did. He was quite comfortable with the idea that his own perceptual mechanism were comparatively crude and limited, and that some people were gifted with greater psychic sensitivity. But her tangential relation to ordinary reality and sustained hypersensitivity were, he thought, possibly more symptomatic of insecurity than of any paranormal endowment. Phyllis, on the other hand, seemed disposed to hide her psychic talents under a veneer of ordinariness. But after dinner on the first day she gave a spontaneous demonstration which John found impressive. Lyle Watson had been talking about his observations of the work of the psychic surgeons in the Philippines, where he had recently seen fit to elicit wonder even in the presently assembled company. On a string around his neck, Lyle wore a black stone, which he said he had picked up in a stream in the Philippines. At Andrija's suggestion, he handed it to Phyllis to see if she could receive any psychic impressions from it. Holding the stone, Phyllis closed her eyes, and while they waited for her reaction, John wondered whether she was going to break out into song in a strange language, but she didn't. She said, "Heat, fire, moving through space." "Interesting," Lyle said, and when Phyllis handed the stone back to him, he told her that it was in fact a piece of meteorite. Whether Phyllis picked up her impression by psychometry or from this object, or by telepathy from Lyle, it was a convincing demonstration of her psychic abilities. It was Phyllis, too, who had introduced the first intimation that this was not going to be any ordinary house party, when shortly after their arrival she gave Andrija a cassette, which she said contained a message from an entity with a name that sounded like Beer, and which had spoken through her during one of her class sessions on the 1st of April. Everyone listened to the message, which went, "We speak of three, one of three, recent, not one of three, of three, center bring one more, become three, surround core, we meet with third within your 8. Then that completes your 3. Rear, or whoever he was or it was, clearly had problems with the language. Well, it was unreasonable to expect busy extraterrestrials to be polyglots, and he was no doubt doing his best, but what could this cryptic jargon mean? Phyllis, who had had time to think about it, recalled that in one of the communications channeled by Bobby, Korean had stated, "You will be meeting number 3 soon." And they had been told pretty clearly that 3 people, apart from Bobby, would make up the group to undertake the work of receiving and propagating the message. Ria's communication would tie in with this. Andrija agreed, and the statement, "We meet with third within your 8, probably meant that within 8 days the meeting with the third person would take place. It was now the 6th day, he pointed out. John and Lyle, the 2 newcomers on the scene, exchanged a glance and knew that they were both thinking the same thought, and it wasn't by telepathy. John noted, too, that the rear communications had been received on April's Fool's Day. A rich man with a reputation for prodigality and an openness of demeanor that can easily be taken for naivety is a natural candidate for paranoia. John lay awake long that night, reviewing what he had seen and heard during the day, and reviewing also the events in his life that had brought him to this place and among these people. What he feared above all was that he might be made a fool of, exploited, ripped off. It had already been mentioned that the work Andrija, Phyllis and Bobby were embarked on would need money. It was scarcely conceivable that the whole story and the supportive tape recordings had been cunningly contrived for his benefit. But on the other hand, the story itself was inconceivable, and the truth had to lie somewhere. Much as he abhorred the idea of being exploited or made a fool of, the idea of exercising in any life situation a corrosive skepticism and negativity cut even more deeply against the grain of his beliefs, and of the personality he had cultivated over the years, since he had sold his ancestral estates and opted out of the status game and the rat race. By temperament and conviction he was a yay-sayer, but he was not fool enough to be unaware that a disposition which is an unqualified virtue in the poor may be an irresponsible folly to the rich. The admirable ethic of his class, which he had imbibed at Eton and Sandhurst, the ethic of noblesse oblige, did not, he was well aware, go so far as recommending the dissipation of the capital upon which noblesse itself rested. Having reneged on the responsibilities of primogeniture, he had put himself in a vulnerable position and had had to construct a personal ethic that took account of that vulnerability. And he had learned to consult his intuition, his gut feeling, in situations which, like the present one, confounded rational judgment. He consulted it now and decided that the situation, bizarre as it was, felt right, and that to act on the assumption that these people were bent on ripping him off would be to succumb to paranoia and to repudiate the positive orientation and personal philosophy that he had based his life on during the past few years. He could at least ride along with it for a while and see what happened. For what if it turned out that this was precisely the point that all he had done, thought and experienced had been leading up to? That was quite a thought. Well, according to the communications, the coming together of Bobby, Phyllis and Andrija had not been a matter of chance. If he was destined to play a part himself, and this visit was part of a plan, then the planners must have conceived the May Lectures project to bring him and Andrija together. He could have sworn it had been his own idea, but the way the theme and timing of the May Lectures coincided with the nature and development of Bobby's healing powers made him wonder. Jim Hurtak could be part of the plan too. Certainly the weeks he had spent with Jim Hurtak the year before had contributed a lot towards preparing him psychologically for the present situation and ensuring that he wouldn't be immediately thrown by it. Hurtak, who had held the post of Professor of Oriental Studies at the California Institute of the Arts at Valencia, was not so much a teacher as an experience, a guru figure whose teachings was not an explanation of objective reality, but a spontaneous creation of ideas and experiences that made his students explore new ideas for themselves and in themselves. Dressed always in a crumpled suit and wearing a black beret perched on the back of his head, Hurtak held classes which sometimes ran as long as 8 hours, during which he would alternate between reading long passages of scripture and delivering rambling commentaries on them. The commentaries were always fascinating and provocative, but now they were connected with the readings. How they were connected with the readings was a mystery to John. He sometimes spoke about UFOs and about his personal contacts with extraterrestrials who, he said, had often intervened in Earth history since prehistoric times, when they had first established a civilization in the Tarim Basin to the north of Tibet. Many of his students recorded his every word, except on occasions when he made them turn off their machines, while he gave them some devastating piece of cosmic news that only he was privy to, and which he had said he was now allowed to share with them. John recalled his first meeting with this strange man, when he had gone along uninvited and unannounced and unknown to one of his classes, and was greeted by the professor with a vigorous handshake and the words, "Good, you've come. I was expecting you." After that he had become a disciple, regularly attending his classes and joining the groups he took on weekend field trips, sometimes visiting scientific research establishments where they were often unaccountably rather coolly welcomed, and on other occasions going to some power spot where they would meditate or listen to Jim preach. It was one of these field trips that had finally led to his moving on from the Hurtak's experience. They left Valencia at dawn in several cars and drove for several hours before turning into a sandy track. This led at last to a wide domed building surrounded by a barbed wire fence on which hung a sign that read, "College of Universal Wisdom." A mile or two beyond this they came to a run-down desert cafe, where Jim introduced them to a grey-haired, stocky man, George Van Tassel, who was the presiding genius of this desert ashram, and presumably the professor of universal wisdom, though on this occasion he didn't dispense much of the latter, of this latter commodity, but talked at length about his contacts with UFOs. Then, in the stifling heat of the desert afternoon, the group sat perched some 20 feet up on some rocks in a semicircle around Jim, who regaled them with an unabridged reading of the book of Isaiah. At dusk they all traipsed deep into the desert on foot to a spot where Jim said was special, though nobody else could tell how it differed from any other sandy waste. And Jim recited a Hebrew incantation, which he said would summon UFOs. As the sky got darker and the stars brighter, John hailed a distant moving light in the sky as their first UFO sighting. Then other members of the party began to see them too, and to utter appropriate expressions of rapture and awe. But try as he may, John couldn't convince himself that they weren't normal aerial phenomenon. He had stopped being a disciple of Jim Wartuck after that experience, but he had remained grateful to him for the expansion of awareness and the sense of the existence and importance of non-ordinary realities that being exposed to the Wartuck personality for 2 months had given him, and he retained a suspicion that Jim as guru had his own ways of disengaging his disciples when their time to move on had come, and that the last field trip he had participated in had perhaps not been as mad and unscheduled as it had appeared at the time. I make a break here. These sessions are quite long, these chapters in the book. So this is the forming of the triangle, the third reading.